They were assembling in the boardroom for the investors' meeting. Peter and Mary were just sitting down when Saul appeared. Today he had chosen a purple cravat to match the colour of the huge black eye he'd acquired over the weekend. Mary raised an eyebrow. "Went over to the festival in Tennessee for a couple of days," explained Saul. "He met a barroom queen in Memphis," amplified Peter. "Spilt my G&T all over him, actually," added Saul. "So you met a gent-soaked barroom queen in Memphis?" Saul nodded. "And tried to take him upstairs for a ride?" she persisted. Saul nodded again, ruefully. "He had to heave him right across his shoulder," said Peter. "Yes, slung me out and gave me this enormous bruise to go with it. I just can't seem to drink it off my mind. Hungover as hell, darlings. Never try to pull a bouncer," concluded Saul sagely. "Virginia, darling, good morning." This to a prim, middle-aged woman, dressed in a blue twin set, who had appeared in the doorway, escorted by Moses. "That's Mrs. Carpenter to you, Saul," she snapped back. "Yes, Mrs. Carpenter, of course, Mrs. Carpenter. Do have a seat," finished Saul silkily, heading round with an over-solicitous manner to pull back a chair. "Is Mr. Carpenter joining us?" "No, Joseph is busy today. How did you get that bruise? Been messing around trying to love the wrong neighbours again?" she asked sarcastically. Saul muttered something inaudible. He was saved from finding a more coherent response by the entry of a youngish man with shoulder-length pale blonde hair, clad in a startling white tuxedo. The overall effect was rather spoiled by his sandals. "Good morning, Mercury," boomed Peter. "What brings you here today?" "Just a flying visit, Peter. Morning, Saul. Morning, Mary. Morning, Mrs. C. The boys wanted me to come over and get the story about this rather worrying trend you have at the moment. We can discuss it in the meeting. Is anyone else coming?" There was something faintly Italian about his accent. "Just Beelzebub, we think, Merc," answered Mary. As if conjured up by the mention of his name, a cloud of expensive cigar smoke, followed by Beelzebub, chairman of Hell's soul-refineries, made its way into the room. Beelzebub was a large man, fatter looking even than Peter, although with Beelzebub Mary had a sneaking suspicion it was all muscle. "One day I'll find out personally," she promised herself, "especially if things don't start going better with Gautama." He wore a check shirt, slightly baggy jeans, large cowboy boots with a particularly outsized spurs curiously moulded into the leather of the heels, and a huge Stetson hat, which he never removed. It seemed to float just fractionally higher than his head. "Howdy, nice to see you all." "Morning, Bubba," chorused Peter, Saul and Mary. They all sat down and the meeting began. It was Peter's turn to take the chair. "Everyone got a copy of the agenda from Moses?" he asked. They all nodded. As company secretary, it was Moses' job to prepare the agenda for the investors' meetings. As usual with his agendas, there were 10 points. "Point 1. Everyone happy with the tablets from the last meeting?" There were nods around the table. Moses etched a note. "Point 2. Current financial returns. Mary, would you take the floor, please?" said Peter. He's at his most pompous in these things, thought Mary, always soaking up to Mercury and Beelzebub in particular, trying to play the big businessman with them. "Well, we'll be paying an exceptionally good dividend to investors this generation," she began. "That's just the point, though, isn't it?" interrupted Mercury. "The boys asked me to pass on the message that we're worried. It's all very well producing exceptional returns from the Black Death, but what about future returns?" "I'm sure they'll be fine," boomed Peter. "Is there any evidence that the Black Death was paid for by Sonny and Cher?" asked Mrs. Carpenter suddenly. "You mean to depopulate Europe so they can move in on the territory?" asked Saul. No, we found no evidence at all." "I mean, you haven't looked, Saul, don't you?" demanded Mrs. Carpenter. "I've just got a new guy joined us from Four Horsemen," said Mary brightly. "I could ask him if he knows anything about it." "Action to Mary for the minutes, please, Moses," said Peter plummily. "It looks to us at Pantheon Alliance like that the fall of Constantinople can only be a matter of time now. In fact, this depopulation you've had can only accelerate the process," said Mercury. Yes, said Peter, "all taken care of. We've been expecting it for some generations, you know." "Of course I know," snapped Mercury. What I don't know is what you're going to do about it. Sonny and Shea will be moving in on your territory before you know it. We are kicking them out of Spain quite well at the moment, Merc, said Saul. Only after they are kicked their way in the first place, which you should have stopped, shouldn't you, Saul? I'm organising a schism, said Peter proudly. Oh, for heaven's sake, cut in Mrs. Carpenter. I bet that's one of your ideas, isn't it, Saul? Mercury continued as if he hadn't heard. The boys think it might be time to cash in. Sell up, like we did at Olympus when it became obvious the punters were going to lose interest in our product. Close it down and sell it while it'll still fetch a good price. We've had a lot of interest in buying this company from Gautama. Jupiter sounded him out at the conference. Mary sat very still. I think that might be a bit premature, Mercury. This from Mrs. Carpenter. What we need, she said acidly, is some updated doctrine. That's your section, isn't it, Saul? Well, right now Peter's doing this schism, replied Saul. And in any case, I'm not sure the Sonny and Shea stuff is quite right for the more urbanised European consumer segment. It's hard enough to get them to pray once on a Sunday without demanding they do it 5 times a day. I don't think they'll be able to expand into our territories. Didn't have stopped them in Spain, observed Mercury. A schism, Peter? Inquired Beelzebub. Yes, said Peter enthusiastically. We're just drawing up the full implementation plans right now, due for delivery within half a generation. Who's doing the theological basis? Oh, Peter is, aren't you, darling? Replied Saul. Peter? Asked Beelzebub with sudden interest. That sounds very good for business. Saul and Mary eyed him suspiciously. Whose business? Wondered Mary. Oh, I'm sure it'll be terrific, absolutely splendid, gushed Peter. Maybe you could be a sponsor, Bubba. I'd like that, replied Beelzebub. I think, he suggested to Mercury, that we should let Peter try this schism before we look at our strategic options. I'll take your views back to the boys, said Mercury. But I think I have to warn you, we're very concerned. We'd like it tabled formally for a full meeting of all investors. Moses, if you'd be so kind to arrange one as soon as Peter's schism has reported some preliminary results. Saul and Mary looked at each other glumly. A full investors' meeting, thought Mary. Close the company, and only Peter's schism to save the day. OK, item 3, political donations. Mercury, this is your point, I think. Yes, I thank you, Peter. As you know, it looks like we're in for a change of government. The Philosophers' Party is getting increasingly unpopular. The next election is due soon, and it looks pretty likely the Divine Right will form the next government of the Great Plains. Can't disagree with you there, Merc, said Beelzebub. The deified Augustus will make a great PM, of course. He can really organise things. But in other ways, such a shame. Nature as Minister for Labour is doing such a great job on the unions. Not had a peep from them for generations. Ah, yes, thought Mary dreamily. The divine Augustus. Bound to win. Got the female vote wrapped up. Pity about that poisonous wife of his. What's the shade Minister for Labour called? I can never remember, asked Peter. Charles Stewart, said Mary. I'm worried he'll just run round like a headless chicken as soon as the going gets tough, said Beelzebub. Anyway, resumed Mercury, we think we should make a small donation, make sure we're in on the ground floor, guarantee our access to the ministers and the PM if we need it. All in favour? Asked Peter, looking around. Good. Another point for the tablets, please, Moses. OK, point 4.